The world always revolves around the order in which the strong try to suppress the weak. Some continents of the modern world have managed to live peacefully away from this behavior for many years. Especially Scandinavian and Baltic countries have been in this position for a long time. Europe also developed its peaceful behavior after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, Poland and other European countries were unitedly protected from the Soviet mentality and oppression under the just roof of NATO and the USA. However, Russia's attempt to invade Ukraine triggered many chain reactions in the world. Everything changed with the entry of Vladimir Putin's armies into Ukraine. Europe, the Scandinavian geography, the Baltics and the United States began to take critical measures against Russia's aggressive policies and threats. One of the strongest trump cards in the current world is the economy. Economic reactions can plunge a country into internal turmoil, popular revolts, and economic crises. The economic crisis and sanctions will degrade the target country's military industry and can seriously reduce its ability to fight. This puts the targeted country under a great deal of pressure and can bring that country under the yoke of the sanctioning country in every field. World superpower countries such as Russia, the United States of America, and China hate to be under each other's economic, military, and political yoke. They hate even more the sanctioned trump card of a much smaller country. Vladimir Putin fell into exactly this position with his aggressive policies. In addition to the heavy sanctions imposed on Russia by powerful countries such as the USA, UK, and France, Russia received one of the biggest economic blows from Belgium. The Belgian government has frozen at least $250 billion worth of Russian assets since the start of the war. That's a huge number and extremely remarkable. The Russian government tried to put pressure on Belgium and the EU in this regard, but Russia's efforts were completely fruitless. Belgium even went further and pressed the button to use the interest income from the Russian assets to help Ukraine. Belgium plans to use all 180 billion euros of interest from frozen Russian assets to support Ukraine's recovery. The country's Prime Minister, Alexander Kroes, made the announcement at a joint press conference with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky in The Hague. In March, Belgium decided to send some of the interest on the tax on frozen assets to support Ukraine. But now the country's government wants to use all the interest received. He also noted that Belgium is ready to play a leading role in supporting the restoration of Ukraine at the European Commission. According to the Belgian Ministry of Finance, 58 billion euros of Russian assets were frozen and 191 billion euros of Russian financial transactions were also blocked. It was stated that as a result of the taxation of the interest from the frozen 250 billion Russian financial assets, a total of 625 million euros were transferred to the Belgian treasury. Thus, Belgium broke the record for freezing Russian assets. At the same time, there are no tangible assets such as real estate or yachts among the Russian assets frozen from Belgium. Goods detained by customs authorities at the port of Antwerp are an exception. Thus, Belgium paralyzed the Russian economy, and as a result, the power and prestige of Russia and Vladimir Putin in the international arena dwindled horribly. The total number of sanctions imposed on Russia is over 14,000. With this number, Russia surpassed all the countries of the world. The United States is one of the countries that imposes the most sanctions on Russia. On the other hand, another country that attracted attention with 774 sanctions was Switzerland. However, Belgian on sanctions against Russia recently overshadowed all these calculations. In short, according to the Belgian Treasury, Brussels has become the leader in Europe in this indicator, which includes the sanctions of Russian assets. It was also among the information that some representatives of the Russian business world transferred their assets to their relatives in order to avoid sanctions. This was reported by Belgium to the European Commission, which added new names and entities to its sanctions list. Answering a question about the possibility of transferring frozen assets to Ukraine, Digest noted that the Belgian constitution and European treaties protect frozen Russian properties. He added that the move would require regulation at the European level. Also, according to a document from the European Commission, the European Union is examining possible options for using and returning the foreign currency reserves frozen in the bloc countries of the Russian Central Bank. Therefore, the EU can divert profits from investments resulting from the freezing of Russian assets to finance the restoration of Ukraine. The bloc's member states formed a working group last month to explore options. Swedish diplomat Anders Omlid, who leads the group, told the newspaper that he agreed that the EU's actions should be in line with the EU and international law. In line with this statement, the working group of the bloc's member states believes that after a certain period of time, the Bank of Russia will be able to prove its arguments in favor of investing its assets and making profits in favor of Ukraine. Flash data was also shared from the European Commission on the freezing of Russian assets. Ursula von, president of the European Commission, announced that after Russia's special operation in Ukraine, Western countries blocked the €300 billion reserve of the Central Bank of the Russian Federation and the €19 billion special fund of Russian businessmen. According to Russian Finance Minister Anton Siluanov, Russia has lost access to half of its gold and foreign exchange reserves, about $300 billion. The European Commission, on the other hand, stated that the blocked funds should be collected in a fund, the funds should be invested, and the profits from these investments should be used for compensatory payments to Ukraine. There was no delay in the response from the Moscow authorities regarding the freezing of Russian assets due to Russia's invasion against Ukraine. Dmitry Peskov, the press secretary of the President of the Russian Federation, claimed that the blocking of assets abroad is against international law. These statements of the Kremlin spokesman, in fact, most clearly revealed this critical situation for Russia because the Russians could not predict that Europe would act in line with a single purpose against the occupation of Ukraine. This reaction after the invasion of Ukraine for unfair reasons will drag both the Moscow administration and the Russian economy into a complete bottleneck in the defense industry. Serious collapses are expected in Russia due to the sanctions as a result. Due to Russia's military operation in Ukraine, the West increased its sanctions against Russia and many European companies withdrew from the Russian market. The European Union has imposed 10 packages of sanctions against Russia since February last year. Russian President Vladimir Putin has previously stated that the policy of containing and weakening Russia is a long-term strategy for the West and that the sanctions deal a serious blow to the entire global economy. But these plans of the Russian leader do not seem to make Europe withdraw its sanctions decisions. The steps to be taken by Russia in this regard are eagerly awaited, especially considering that we have entered the spring period and we will see an increase in clashes in the Russia-Ukraine war. Russia will be severely restrained by this heavy economic blow. In this critical time period, Ukraine's military and financial support from the West will play a prominent role in the course of the war. In fact, this is exactly what we're talking about all the time. Yes, when we look at it, Ukraine has much more limited resources than Russia, both economically and militarily. But since the beginning of the war, Western and U.S. sanctions against Russia and military aid to the Ukrainian army have taken the Ukrainians a few steps beyond the Russians in the war. Therefore, the Russians suffer heavy losses on the front lines due to the sanctions they have received in the economic and diplomatic fields. Because it is impossible for even the soldiers and commanders in the Russian army to continue this war without basic needs. As a result, this chain-like cycle causes Russia, which has one of the most powerful armies in the world, to melt away on the territory of Ukraine. In other words, the continuation of the Western and U.S. sanctions against Russia will leave Russia much weaker in this war of attrition. Ukraine, on the other hand, will do its part and strike the final blow in order to end the war when the time comes. There is a lot of good news from the east. Ukrainian head of the Eastern Group of Forces stated that the continuous effective destruction of main Russian ammunition depots created shortages of shells on the front, which do not allow the Russians to cut off Bakhmut from supplies. He also noted that they are not blind to the situation and that there is a good reason why there is still in Bakhmut. And today I will tell you exactly what this reason is. First of all, the Russians are trying to encircle Bakhmut simultaneously from two directions when it comes to the northern axis of advance. Last time I told you that the Russians opened access to the northern suburbs of Brestkovska. I also told you that if the Russians managed to enter Paraskeva from this side, the Ukrainians in Krasnohorivka would need to withdraw rapidly. If you look closer, we can immediately understand why. As you can see, Krasnaya Gora is separated from Brestkovska by 200-meter wide field. So if the Russians establish control over the first block of buildings, they will be able to have complete fire control over the area and cut off the Ukrainians in Krasnohorivka from supplies. And this is exactly what they attempted to do today. Unfortunately for the Russians, there is plenty of natural barriers that significantly limit the room for maneuver. They cannot go around these barriers because they will be going up the hill and exposing themselves to the fire from Brestkovska, and they cannot attack it from the east because of the railway embankment and the river. That is why, for now, Russian attacks are successfully rebuffed and the Ukrainians continue to maintain control over this area. Nonetheless, the Ukrainian command noted that they accounted for contingencies and are ready to adjust rapidly to any developments in this region. When it comes to the southern axis of advance, last time I told you that the Russians have moved into directions towards the forest near Bakhmut and towards the forest near Ivanovskaya. The main goal here is to establish direct fire control over the main supply road to Bakhmut. The Russians can either do it by establishing control over the suburbs or by establishing control over the forest. If we look at the topographic map, we can see that these two areas are located at a much higher elevation than the road, although the second option is inferior because it will open access only to a small section of the road and from a disadvantageous angle. The Ukrainians understand this, and so far they are successfully preventing Russian advances in these areas. But the Russians are adapting, and as the Ukrainian servicemen operating in Bakhmut noted in a recent interview, the Russians are committing more elite special operations and reconnaissance elements to augment human wave attacks. The head of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic recently made a claim that they completed the operational encirclement of Bakhmut. The head of the Wagner Group, which is actually responsible for carrying out this operation, responded that this is not true. Other Russian military-affiliated people and officers in reserves confirmed that the Ukrainians are still supplying Bakhmut with everything that is necessary. They also critiqued the Russian Ministry of Defense for not allocating endless supplies of mortars, artilleries, and shells to be able to fire at these roads non-stop. One of the reasons why the Russians are not able to do it lies in constant hammer strikes that target Russian ammunition depots. Luhansk People's Militia reported that the Ukrainians recently struck their bases in Alkovsk and Kadiivka. Geolocated footage confirmed that the strikes were successful. Even the Russian reserves of shells are endless. Such strikes disrupt their logistics and create short-term deficits on the front. The head of the Ukrainian Eastern Group of Forces confirmed that Ukrainian forces are still able to supply units in Bakhmut effectively, and noted that the Ukrainian military command is ready for the deterioration of the situation and has already worked out all possible contingency plans. He stated that the main reason why the Ukrainians continue to stay in Bakhmut is that the Russians are overcommitting their forces in this region in an attempt to seize the town by the anniversary of this war. This allows the Ukrainians to leverage this extremely well-fortified town and inflict disproportionately high losses on the attackers. He stated that they did the same thing in Lysychansk, and this decision allowed them to exhaust Russian forces to the point where they even took an operational pause. Nonetheless, there is still plenty of indicators that the Ukrainians have finally started to withdraw to the western side of Bakhmut. The Ukrainians reportedly moved 3 streets back in the northern part of Bakhmut. They finally gave the champagne factory to the Russians in the eastern part of Bakhmut, and the war footage also frequently features fights taking place deeper in the residential area. At this time, the Ukrainians are relying on the meat processing plant, high-rise buildings, and the local river as the main defensive positions. It looks like they are now ready to withdraw, and the northern and eastern groups will likely cross the river near the first bridge, and the southern group will cross it near the dam after the Ukrainians move to the western side. Escaping encirclement and leaving Bakhmut altogether will be much easier. Overall, the Russians are committing significant amounts of resources, including elite special operators, to take Bakhmut at all costs in the next 3 weeks. The Ukrainians are using Bakhmut as a trap or a bait in order to exhaust Russian forces so that after taking the town, the Russians will be enabled to immediately start storming the next line of defense. Similar to what we saw in Lysychansk, an operational pause or even just a necessary decrease in the intensity of Russian attacks will give the Ukrainians the valuable time that they need to receive Western weapons. After a long time in captivity, the freedom struggle of the Ukrainians has begun to increase its influence in recent days. The wind blowing in the Donbass is currently creating a storm in the Crimea. The Ukrainians have completely blockaded Crimea, the most strategic center of the war, for the last 2 weeks. The latest attacks of the Ukrainian armed forces this time targeted Sevastopol, the largest port city in Crimea. According to the governor of the city of Crimea, Ukraine launched the attacks with drone swarms near Sevastopol. Other attacks this week in the north of the peninsula, which Kiev insisted on retaking from Russian occupation, were already heralded. Ukraine's drone army tried to hit the coastal base in Sevastopol. Moscow-backed Sevastopol. Governor Mikhail Vasilyev stated that the Ukrainian attacks were stopped by Russia's Black Sea Fleet. However, after the airstrikes of the Ukrainian forces, a serious fire started in the region. A video of this fire, which broke out near the entrance to the Sevastopol Bay, was shared on social media, but it was not clear what exactly burned. Razvasev reported that 3 surface drones were destroyed at around 5 a.m. He reported that the Navy crews fired small arms at the Ukrainian drones and also that the Russian air defense was active to repel the attacks. In the statements also reported by the Russian state news agency RIA Novosti, Razvasev stated that Russian warships were not damaged in this drone attack. However, no definitive proof has been presented in this regard. Also, in a follow-up post, the governor of Sevastopol stated that Ukrainians had launched an information attack. Radio signals were cut off to spread the word that passengers on ferries on the peninsula were evacuated. Razvasev claimed that this was completely false news, but according to Transport Sevastopol's Telegram channel, on the morning of the attack, passenger transport by sea in Sevastopol was suspended. The RIA reported that the blasts completely shattered the windows into buildings in the city center. The report also emphasized that since last July, Ukrainian forces have once again targeted the city, which is the main base of the Black Sea Fleet, with UAVs. RIA added that most of the drones were destroyed by air defense systems. These stunning drone attacks were not limited to Sevastopol either. Ukraine's drone army recently targeted the Crimean city of Tongoy. Videos of the explosion that took place in this Russian-controlled town have emerged. The Ukrainian military intelligence agency announced that the explosion in the town of Tsankawi in the north of Crimea destroyed the Russian caliber cruise missiles while being transported by rail. The missiles were to be transported by rail to be launched from Russian ships in Moscow's Black Sea Fleet in the Crimean port city of Sevastopol. Anton Gerashenko, advisor to the Ukrainian Interior Ministry, shared footage of the explosion on Twitter, and a voice in the video confirmed that the explosion was filmed around the town's train station. In another clip shared by journalist Maria Avdeeva, a beam of light and a loud explosion could be heard from the camera's vantage point without directly taking responsibility for the explosion. The main Directorate of Intelligence of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine stated that the Russian-caliber missiles destroyed in the explosions have a range of more than 1,500 miles against land targets and more than 230 miles against sea targets. The statements of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense actually pointed out that a great danger was averted. On March 9th, Kiev officials reported that 20-caliber sea-launched cruise missiles were fired overnight into Ukrainian territory as part of a wave of attacks across the war-torn country. Ukrainian forces had previously managed to thwart the threat of a new Russian missile attack with an army of drones. The Russian-backed mayor of Tsankawi, Igor Ivan, stated that the explosion occurred as a result of an unmanned aerial vehicle attack and that the air defense should be improved as soon as possible. In addition, Igor Ivan declared a state of emergency in Tsankawi, where the danger still remains. Sergei Aksionov, a Kremlin-backed official who has served as the leader of Crimea since the peninsula was annexed 9 years ago, said that as a result of the attacks in Tsankawi, 1 person was injured and 2 buildings were damaged. But Aksionov did not mention the Russian cruise missiles destroyed in these explosions. Tsankawi, which serves as a major base for the Russian army, is home to one of Russia's largest air bases in Crimea. The Defense Ministry considers the town a key road and rail junction that plays an important role in enabling Russia's operations in southern Ukraine. For this reason, the drone attacks of the Ukrainian forces on the city caused serious concern to the Russians. Although the Russian authorities claim that these attacks in Crimea do not cause a great danger, the situation in the peninsula is quite critical because an airstrike occurs in Crimea almost every day. While the situation on the front in Ukraine was in such a state, the issues related to the peace talks proposed to end the war began to come to the fore following the Ukrainian attacks in Crimea. Important statements were made by Russia regarding peace talks. Russia's foreign ministry has rejected a proposal that Ukraine's most powerful Western partners participate in final peace talks to end Moscow's ongoing occupation of its neighbor. The Russian ministry reported that the US, Britain, Germany, and France cannot be considered reliable mediators in any peace negotiations due to their involvement in the conflict, which is now in its 2nd year. Tensions in the war escalated even more after the Russian Foreign Ministry rejected the latest proposal by senior German diplomat Wolfgang Ischinger that the US, Britain, France, and Germany form the core of a Western mediation group to put an end to the war. The official of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs said these countries support the so-called peace initiatives of Zelensky, which is an ultimatum for our country to surrender. With such approach the USA, England, France, and Germany cannot claim to be impartial mediators initiating the peace process. They are not interested in resolving the crisis and are doing everything they can to maximize conflict. In reality, Russia remains the only obstacle to peace in Ukraine. Only Russia can end this war today. In other words, the statements of the Russian Foreign Ministry do not mean anything other than escalating this war. These statements are seen as purely an excuse for the Russians who do not want to approach peace. The US, on the other hand, wants to see this war come to an end. But for peace to be lasting, it must be just and secure. The policy followed by the US administration is exactly in this direction. But the Russians do not take a peaceful stance. On the other hand, it is the goal of Kiev's allies to ensure that Ukraine is in the strongest possible position for negotiation. To this end, The U.S. administration is helping Ukraine regain control and defend territories seized by Russia since February 2022 or since 2014. There seems to be almost no hope for the renewal of peace talks as the massive invasion of Russia continues. Negotiations begin only hours after the start of the Russian offensive on February 24, 2022. But from the very beginning, these peace talks did not work out due to espionage and mistrust. In the spring of 2022, talks were interrupted entirely amid growing evidence of Russian atrocities. Although the two sides met to conclude a grain export agreement covering the Black Sea, there were no negotiations to temporarily or permanently end the war. President Volodymyr Zelensky proposed a 10-point peace agreement that includes the withdrawal of all Russian troops from Ukrainian territory, compensation for war damage and war crimes prosecution for Russian leaders. Moscow immediately rejected this offer for negotiations to be fruitful. The warring parties must have a genuine interest in sitting at the table. We'll have to see if the spring attack by the Russian or Ukrainian side will be successful. We believe that negotiations can only take place when Ukraine and Russia find themselves in a very difficult situation.